Hi guys, I'm Anjali from Simplilearn. Now, if you have been following our playlist on Python, by now you have probably completed all the basic concepts of Python. So today we'll use these basic concepts in creating a website using Python again. Now, this application is called Django. And before we move into actually developing the website, let's better understand what Django is. So Django is a high-level Python web framework. So when you compare Django to many of its other counterparts, such as Flask, which also uses Python, it provides very limited freedom. But then again, this limited freedom does mean that it makes development much faster, and that is the goal of Django. So if you're a complete beginner with web development and also sort of with Python, this is the place to start. So Django has a free and a paid version, but since you're just learning how it works, we can go for the free version. In fact, the paid version is only required when it's utilized by companies where they perform a lot of modifications to the point that it's actually unrecognizable. Now, some of the companies which are using Django are Instagram, Bitbucket, Pinterest, and even NASA. Now, there's another important thing that we need to understand about Django, which is its design pattern. So Django follows the MTV design pattern, where MTV stands for Model Template View. These terms may seem very remote to you right now, and I don't think there'd be a point of me explaining what they are as of now. So once we move on to the demo, where I'll be teaching you how you can create the web framework, we can better understand how this design pattern works. And with that, we are finally ready to move into actually creating our website. So there are certain prerequisites to Django. To perform these, open your command prompt. So the first thing we need to ensure is that your system has Python installed. Now, of course, if you're learning Django, you probably already know Python. And for this purpose, you would have had Python installed previously itself. We'll just check. So type in Python version, and if you do have Python installed, your version number will appear here. Now, the other thing we need installed is pip. So once again, pip would also be installed on your systems. It comes with Python itself. And so yeah, I have pip 19.0.2 version. Now, once those two things are done, we'll move on to a virtual environment. So a virtual environment is basically this environment that we create to isolate our application. Now, this is necessary in Django because often we make applications, we have completely built the application, and now we do not want to touch them. We do not want to create anything new. We do not want to update any packages that are already being used. So if you're creating a new application for which you need to update the packages, we don't want the implementation of that to hamper with the implementation of our current application. So this is why we completely isolate them. So for that, the first thing you do is you need to install the virtual environment wrapper. We'll use the pip command to do so. So pip install virtual env wrapper. So if you're using any other system such as Linux systems, and then press enter, but in case of Windows, put a dash and win, which signifies Windows. So I already have my virtual environment installed. So now we have Python, we have our pip, and we have the virtual environment. Now let's create a virtual environment. So to create the virtual environment, type in mk virtual env and the name for your virtual environment. So previously I had made a virtual environment py1. This time I'll go with py2, and that should create your environment. So a virtual environment is created, which is py2, and as soon as it's created, you'll notice that now your commands start running in py2. So when you're creating an application, the application itself is not created at this place. It's just the environment files that's stored in here. So now all this is done. The final prerequisite is, of course, to have our web framework, we need to install Django. So let's get to that. Pip install Django. So now that Django is installed, we are finally ready to start our project. So the command to run to start your first project, Django-admin start project, and followed by the name of your project. So I'll just name my project the Django project. So I just cleared my screen. Now, if you go to this location where we created our project, you'll see the project folder is created here. And inside the folder, there's yet another folder with the same project name and a manage file. Now, this manage file is usually what we will be running to compile our programs. And then within the folder, you have certain Python files. So we'll open all this in our IDE, and I'll be using PyCharm, but you can go ahead with any other Python IDE. In fact, you can even use a notebook. So you can select your project from here, the panel on the left, or you can opt for open, browse through your folders, and then select your project. So the project we created just now is the Django project. project, which is this one. So I'll open it and your project will appear on the left side panel here. You can see within it there's another folder with the same project name, and there's the manage.py file. Now within this folder again there's another folder .idea, and then there is the init settings URL and the WSGI file, although we won't be making changes or modifying any of these files. So we'll check out what these files are one by one, although we won't be making modifications to most of them. The idea folder probably won't be existing in your project. You can completely ignore that. Now we'll have a look at what each of these Python files do. So the first file, which is the init file, as you can see, it's empty. The reason is that the very presence of this file is only to inform that this package here, this is not any ordinary folder, it's a Python package. So you don't really need any content within this. Now the next file that we have here is the settings file. So the settings file is the central configuration file. This is modified only when your application goes into the real world. Other than that, we just leave it as it is. So some of the values that you would be modifying is, for example, the debug value. Now when the debug value is true, which in our case it is, whenever an error occurs in any of your code and you're trying to run that page, all the errors appear on the page. But now if you are putting your website into the real world, you do not want that all your errors will be displayed on the page for obviously security reasons. So then you can just change this value to false just before you upload your page. Next, you have the URLs page. As from the name, it's very clear. The URLs page is where you have your URL stored. So basically, this file maps the URL of a page to the function that the page will be performing. So now you have the wsgi.py code file. So this page contains an application callable which the application server uses to communicate with your code. And finally, we have the manage.py page. This is the page used to interact with your project. So we never ever touch the manage.py page. The settings page does change when your website goes into the real world. The URLs page we will be actually modifying during the course of our project. Again, the wsgy.py page, we leave it untouched. So now that you know the basics of what each file already present does, we can start our demo. So before we start coding our website, there's a dummy development server which is provided with Django. So we'll just check that out first. Just go to your command prompt and move into the path of your project. And then you just type Python manage.py run server. And as you can see here, the development server has started and it's at port 8000. So go to your browser, open any browser of your choice, localhost, and at 8000 port. And as you can see here, since we have installed our Django and we ran our server, so our Django page has appeared here and it says that our installation worked successful. So far all good. We can now start building our project. So what website are we creating? Well, I was thinking of a very basic website where you'll have the front page. The first page would have probably like 3-4 genres, and within each genre you'll have a piece that is an article, a novel, or even a poem of that particular genre. So the user gets to click the genre on the first page, and the minute he or she does so, we move on to the next page where we have our article within that genre displayed. We'll also include a registration page just to see how that works with Django. So before we move on, guys, I want to tell you that this tutorial will completely concentrate on how Django works. So we will not look much into the details of how our page is displayed. That is, we won't go in depth into HTML, CSS, and so on, but rather just stick to Django and its functionality. And another thing that we need to know about Django before we start developing is that every page in Django is called an app. So when you go to a website, say Facebook for instance, you have multiple tabs, right? So there's a tab for the profile. You click on it and it immediately takes you to your profile. Now, if this entire thing, that is Facebook, was built on Django, then your profile would be one app. And then there's another tab which takes you to your messages. The page where all your messages are displayed, that would be a second app. So that's how Django works. Every small thing, every component or every page of your website is an app, and you need to ensure that you can describe exactly what an app does in 1 or 2 sentences. So a page should not have multiple things happening on it. If a page is for displaying messages, that should be the sole purpose of the page. So yeah, that's the basic of apps and how they are a part of Django. So how do we create this app? Just open your command prompt, move on to the path where your project is stored. Now in here, you'll type in the command to create your first app. So that's Python manage.py start app, and then the name for your app. So I'll name my app genre. So basically on my first page, I want all my genres to be displayed, and every article is put under a particular genre, hence the name. Enter, and your app should be created. So I go back to my PyCharm, and as you can see here, we have our app genre created in here. Now under this app, there are more number of files. So what do these files do? We'll discuss that first. Well, first is our migrations folder. Now inside this migration folder, there'll be a number of files which will be created. Once we go through our project, we'll see every time we execute a particular command, a new file is inserted into the migrations folder. So this basically connects your database with your source code, and that might seem very complicated, but actually Django makes it extremely easy. And then you have the admins page. Now this admin file or this admin page that Django provides is extremely useful. So it's like this dummy admin page where you can actually go and you can view your entire database there in a very formatted way. You have all the models that you created there. You can insert more values, you can delete values, you can edit values which are already present. So right now the admin page will not be existing. There's no point of us going and checking it right now since we have not created any models yet. Again, what is models? I'll come to that too. So that is the next file I'll be telling you about. Now, if you have gone through object-oriented programming, Python or Java or any other object-oriented programming, as a matter of fact, you probably know the concept of classes. Now, over here in our models file, we create classes, and each of this class is actually a model. And by that, we mean it's a database. So when we create a class, we have a number of attributes in this class, and each of this attribute forms a column in our database. So that is what will be happening here. And once we create our class or what we call model, that is when we can actually view the admin page. And we'll see how this page is extremely helpful. The next important page is the views page. So guys, if you remember, initially I told you that Django has a design pattern, which is the model view template, where model is already discussed. They are the classes. Template, as you probably guessed, is the look of the page. So that's basically a HTML files. And what brings the model and the template together? That is the view. So view adds the functionality. Now, whenever you receive a request from the user for a particular URL, view will describe the response for this request. But view is not responsible for giving the response. That is another file that we'll be creating, as you'll see in some time. So now when I go back to my web page here, there's no URL for this. This is just a domain name. But once we start creating our website, the very existence of each web page is linked to a presence of a URL. So that is exactly where we'll start building. Under our Django project folder, we have this URLs page. There's already a URL path present here. It says admin, which is, as you guessed, it's the URL to the admin page that is by default provided by Django. And over here, there's this another parameter. So what this parameter is, it's the response that is to be given for the request that you receive. Now, just in this manner, we need to add the URL for our first page, which is going to be the genres page. So I say path, genres. And then in here, I'll insert the action. So I've not created any action yet. So I don't know what to put in there either as of now. But guys, think about this. So if our website has 10 pages, does this mean that we'll have 10 different URLs going in here? That would be quite haphazard, wouldn't it? So we need a more organized way of doing this. And for that very purpose, we will use genres, the app, as our base app. So if from genres, we are moving on to our second page. So So say our genres has our 3 genres, which is fiction, inspiration, and something else. So the user clicks on fiction, and this immediately takes the user to the second page where the content in fiction is displayed. So then our second page should be a sub page of genre in a way. And every other page that we move to from our first page should be the same. So for this purpose, what we can do is we'll go to our genres app, the package, we'll create another URLs file within genre, and in this URLs file, we'll define the URL for our second page with reference to our genres URL. So how is that done? Well, the first thing you need to do is you must copy paste this statement here into our URLs page. For this page, we do not really need to import include, so I'll remove that part out. And I also need to define my URLs pattern, so copy paste this too. But again, admin is already defined there completely. We do not require that. Now here we'll say, if the user wants the page genres, this is going to be my first page. That is my front page. So what will be the response to this? The response will obviously be defined in our views page. Right now, we have not created anything in our views page, but we will soon, and we will name the response for the URL genres as index, since that is usually what the purpose of the front page is. It's usually to display the index. So we'll have view dot index, and then following this we'll also give a name to this very particular call, and the purpose of that I will explain later. Just name this index for now. It's not view, it's views. And also we need to now import views. Okay, so we define that if the user goes to this page genre, then we will be displaying whatever's defined under views.index. Of course, we have not created that yet, and we'll move on to that in a while. Now, the problem is every request that is made by the user, the first thing Django does is it checks the URLs page under your main project, which is this page. And under this page, we have not defined the action for genres. And it would be very repetitive to define this again. So what we do instead is we'll just include the file where we did define the function for genres. And that is genres.urls. So the user gives a request for the genres page. Django checks out this main URLs page. It sees it matches the URL to this very particular pattern here. And for that, it knows that the response is to include the genres.url page. So it includes this page. And within this page, we of course have the function or the response defined. So now the next thing is to create the response. So now under this views file, we'll create a view. The first thing is we need to import the HTTP package. The request is always HTTP, and this time the response that we are providing is also a HTTP response. We'll change this later because we'll need a more defined response, but for now we'll stick to a very basic display on our first web page. So let's import django.http, import HTTP response, and now we can define a function which will tell what response to provide for the particular URLs. Now here we say that if the user gives a request for this URL, our response is views.index. So within views, we need to define a function named index. So def index, and this one takes request as a parameter and returns a HTTP response. And that response could be a simple text. Of course, you can also have HTML tags, and just for the purpose of formatting so that our text looks pretty bold, I'll put this into our header. Just say hello world. So that's done. This is the response that we'll be providing for that particular URL. Now the thing is, we have this page here, settings, and in settings, if you scroll down, you'll see there's a list of apps which are installed, and in this list, our app genre is not mentioned. So before we run our server, we'll add our app to this list. So that's done. Now go to your web page, the one where you ran your local host first. And this time, okay, so my server's not running. I need to start my server first. Type in your command python manage.py run server, and it says that there's no issue and our server is currently running. So you go back to the page where we ran our local host. So the last time we ran our local host, currently your page would still be on that if you have not done any modifications. I did a few in between, hence I got this page. Now if you check out localhost again, you'll see that there's an error. This is because now we started defining the URLs in our URL page. So when you don't give any URL as such, such, Django checks out the two URLs defined here and says, hey, what you typed in here, whatever your request was, does not match any of the URL patterns. So now we want to check out the genres page and enter, and as you see here, hello world is displayed. So of course this is a dummy page. We need to do something way more. We need to create a web page, and that is what we'll get to. Okay, so now that we viewed our dummy web page, the next thing we need to do is actually populate this app with some data. Now to populate the app with data, of course we need to first store the data, and that is stored in a database. So with Django, you would have probably already noticed here, there's this file called SQLite3. So this is the database management system that comes along with Django. It's already set up to be used, just a small command, a small tweak that we require, and everything will work perfectly fine. So what this does is basically all the data that you enter through your model will work along with this. So that means that there should be a communication between your SQLite and your source code. Now, if I go back to the terminal where I ran my server, you'll see here there's an error line which says you have 15 unapplied migrations and your project may not work properly. Right now, what we designed worked right because we didn't have any data stored. But from now on, we will be storing data. So we need to ensure that the migrations are done right. And by migrations, we mean that our database management, that's SQLite, is synced pretty well with our source code. So first of all, stop your server, and now you run a command to do the syncing, which is python manage.py migrate. And as you hit this command, the syncing is happening. So when you say that the migrations are complete, what you actually mean is when Django looks at your installed apps, this is an app that we created and we just added it a while back to this list of installed apps, but everything else in here in this list was already present. So these are some default apps which Django or this project in particular will already work with, and many of these apps require to access some databases. It could not do that until now, but now that we finished our migrations, when Django checks out these apps and needs to run them, it can easily access the database, take whatever data is required from there and perform its functions. Again, if we go back to our command prompt and run the server again, you'll see that this time we do not get the error of the unapplied migrations. So that is how you sync your database with your source code. Now, once we create our models, it means that we have added some new classes. There are some new tables which are going to be added. So again, we need to perform the migration function, which we'll look into later. Now let's get to creating our classes. So as I mentioned earlier, models are basically classes. Now there are two classes that we will be creating for this particular project. The first class will have all the genres, and the second class which will hold all the articles. So let's begin coding. Now my first class, I'll call it collection. And every class needs to import from models.model. Now within this class, all we need to define are its various attributes. So I'll explain this again. The class is basically a table, and all your attributes of the particular class are the columns. So the first thing is the collection name or the genre name. Now the collection name would be something like fiction or inspiration or non-fiction. Could be anything, and all these are strings. So when you're inputting them, so in Django basically that's the char field type. So you say models.char field, and a compulsory parameter here is you have to insert the maximum length. I'll give it 100 characters. Next thing, we'll have a description for each genre type. That again would be char field. Enter a max length. Give it 500. And then we'll also have an image or a cover for each of the collection or each of the genre. So that would be, I'd say, call cover, as in collection cover. So this again will be a char field type, as I'm going to enter the link for the image over here. Now the links would be pretty large. So I'd say a length of 1000. So that's our first class. Now we'll define a second class, which is for the particular articles or the pieces which are inside the collection. So here we'll just go for one article within a collection, and I'll name this class as piece, as in a piece within a collection. Again, this class too imports from models.model, and we will enter the column names now. So every piece will have a title, which would be the name of the piece, and that too would be of char field type. Give this a 200. And then all of these will have a particular type. That is, whether it's a book, it's a novel, it's a poem, or it's a blog post. That is what will go in our type variable. Next, we'll have the artist name. For a book, that would be an author. For a poem, that would be a poet. So we'll go for the general term, which is artist. The year it was published. Now the year would be an integer. So we have a different field type here, the integer field, and that does not require a max length. And finally, again, for each piece, you'll have a cover. So I'll name that piece cover. Again, we'll pass the link of an image here. So char field with the max length of 1000. And yeah, so our two models are created here, class collection and class piece. Now once again, we'll do the migration, and what will happen is that the database will link with this model, and then we can finally view the admin page and see what exactly that admin page is that we've been talking about all this while. But before we move on, we are missing out on something. So we have our collection and we have each piece. How do we link the piece with the collection? Well, this is where the concepts that you probably learned in database is going to come into use. This is where we'll use a foreign key. So although we are writing a code here, this is exactly how a table in a database will be created. So every item would have a primary key, and now we are going to use foreign keys in our class piece to link each piece to a particular collection. So if I say Dan Brown's book origin, so that should be linked through the foreign key with our collection fiction. So let's create our foreign key, and I'll name it collection, but this time with a small c. Models.foreign key. So to the foreign key, you pass the table name to which you're making the reference first, which is collection, and then you pass on an action as to what will happen to a particular piece if the collection that it's linked to is deleted. So what we want is, if suppose fiction is deleted, then automatically origin, which is tied with fiction, should also be deleted, and that is called a cascade delete. So you say on delete models.cascade. And now we are finally done creating our models. So now that our models are created, we know these particular models are created for our application or our app genre. So you go back to the settings page, and here we had previously inserted this app genre, but back then it was not really required. It was just that there is this other app that is not included in the default apps given by Django. So let's put in the name there. But now that we actually have a database associated with this app, we need to specify this app in its complete structure. That is the configuration. So if you go under genres, and then there's this file apps, and under apps, you can see this class genre config. Copy this, go back to settings. So genre.apps.genre config. So now when you run your server, Django will check the list of installed apps and will be able to access the database associated with our newly created app too. But there's more to it than that. Remember how previously we made migrations so we can link our database with the source code? Now we got to make those migrations again, because now we created new models. So every time you create a model or you make some changes to your models, you always need to do your migrations. And this time, since our migrations is specific to a particular app, the syntax is slightly different. So you can also use this terminal down here. It works just the same. And Python manage.py, make migrations, and your app name. Enter. And as you see, it says the models, collection and piece have been created. Now what this migrations exactly does is it converts these models that you have written in coded format into an SQL form. So that's where your tables and everything's stored. And now if you check your migrations folder, you'll see there's a new file under it. That is the current migration that you attempted. So now that the migrations are made, you can finally run your project. So once again, an overall migrations. So I'm back to my command prompt, since the black background makes it easier to see the text. Break out of your server, and we finished our migration. So now we can run our server. No issues, and there's no error with the migrations either. Let's now check out our genre page. Of course, it'll look the same, because although we created our models, what the models will be reflected in is the database. The overall look of the page so far has not been changed, so it's the same. So I'll repeat that once again. Every time you make a change to your model or you add some new class to your model, first run the migrations for that particular app. That is Python manage.py make migrations and your app name, and then you run a migrations in general. So that's Python manage.py migrations, and then you can run your server. Okay, so our database is created, but right now it's empty. So our next step is to populate our database. For that, again, open a command prompt, and now you need to enter into the SQL's shell. So the command for that is Python manage.py shell. But before that, I'll just go to the path where my project is stored. And now in here, I'll execute my command. So once you get these 3 arrows, you know that you have entered the shell, and over here, you can execute your SQL commands. Now, before we input values into our tables, what we need to do is we have to import these tables, because even within this project, there are multiple number of tables. There are some tables which were in there by default too. So from genre.models, import collection, piece, which are the name of our tables, and enter. So our tables are now imported. Now first we'll populate our table collection. Okay, so collection has 3 columns. There's the collection name, there's a description, and there's a cover image. So go back to your shell. So we'll have an object here, collection1, which will be equal to collection. So this would be the constructor for our class collection. And within this, we'll insert our values. So our first attribute is collection name, and that's equal to fiction. Our second attribute is the description, and we'll say enter the world of fantasies for the description of fiction. And finally, we have the attribute called cover, which is the collection cover. And in here, I'll just enter the URL of an image I found online. So that's it. We have entered the values for our 3 attributes. Now press enter. Now let's view if this is actually stored in our database. So for that, you execute the command, your table name, which is collection.objects.all, and it's empty. So what's wrong? We created an object in which we inserted all the values, but then still our database seems to be empty. So this is because so far this collection object that we created is only stored in our shell's memory. We have not actually committed this to the database. So the command for committing this to the database would be our object name, which is call1.save. And once again, we'll execute the command to check everything that's present in our database collection. And now you can see finally that there is an object present. And now we can also check the value of the various columns in our table collection for this particular object. You can say call1.collection name and gives you the collection name. Similarly, you can also check its description. Now, as I mentioned previously, every object that you create in a table has a primary key associated with it. So the primary key basically holds the uniqueness of that particular row. So we can also check the primary key for a particular row or an object. Just go for call1.pk and it says the primary key is 1. Now the primary key is also known as the ID of the object, so you can identify it as ID2. Again, you'll get the value, which is 1. Now if you want to change the value of any of these columns, that can also be done very easily on the shell. So suppose I want to change the description, say call1.description, and initially it was enter the world of fantasies. I want it to be welcome to the world of fantasies. So welcome to the world of fantasies. And now if I check the value of call1.description, the value has changed. So that's pretty simple, isn't it? Now, if you think this is simple, there's a much more simpler way of adding values to the database, which we'll see just in a while. And that is where we'll put in more objects. We'll have a few more genres and we'll also add elements to our table piece. So now we can look into how to create our admin page. So now that we learned how to input or populate our database through the shell, let's go for the easier and the more efficient way, which is through the admin. Now before we do that, we need to create an admin. And for that, go to your command prompt out of the shell. Now in your command prompt, type the command python manage.py create super user. Okay, so once you do that, they'll ask you to create a username. and we'll just go for admin since we are creating ourselves as the admin. Enter an email ID. Just go with admin123@admin.com and a password. So since this is not a production environment, I'm gonna just bypass the password validation. But if your website is going into the real world, then make sure things are secure enough. And our super user is created successfully. So now we can go on to a browser, and here we'll just type admin. So this is our admin page. You can see here there are two tabs, groups and users. But the main reason that we require the admin page does not seem to come out here. We expected there to be our database tables present here so we can directly go and edit them or add some values to them. But it's not there. So what is missing is that we need to go back to our Python page, and over here, go down to the admin file. So here we need to add the models that we want to appear in the admin page. Basically, we need to register those models with the admin page. And for that, the first thing we do is we have to import the model. So from .models, import, and our two classes are collection and piece. So we have not added anything to our table piece yet. We will later on, but anyhow, we'll just register both of them at one shot. And you type in here admin.site.register collection. Copy paste this and change the collection to piece, which is our second table. And that's it. So with just these two lines of code, you should have your collection and your piece tables appearing in the admin page. Now when I move back to the admin page and refresh this, you'll see that our tables have appeared here. Click on collection and there's one collection object here. Click on that, you can see the values of the attributes. And through this admin page now, I'll show you how you can add more objects. So just press on save and add another. Here we can enter our second collection's name, which in my case is inspiration, and description would be inspired to do more. And for call cover, which is the collection cover, I have another link that I just took from the net. Save, and we'll add one more. So we'll have 3 collections now. And our third collection would be horror. The description, let's say the fear is real, although we hope it's not. And finally, we have the collection cover. Paste the link here. Save this too. So now we have 3 objects under collection. Now, as you see here, all our collection objects just say collection object with a number in bracket. In the similar manner, when we were also going through our shell, every time we executed the command collection.objects.all, we got just the name collection object and a number. But we want something more meaningful. So when I look at this table of collections, I know that the first one is the collection fiction. The second one is the collection inspiration, and so on. So for that, go back to your code. So go under your models.py file, and under the class collection, we'll define a special method, which is _str. Now this is an overriding method, that is, this method's already defined, but the value returned by this method is not of much meaning to us as of now. So now over here, we'll return something that we actually want to see when we look at the objects in our table collection. And what I want is, I want the collection name to appear. That would be quite clear as to what object is at which position. So I say collection, return self.collection name, and that should do it. Now in the similar manner, we can have the same function for piece 2, and for piece what we want to return is the title. So that's it. Now if I go back to my admin page, refresh this, as you can see, we have something much more meaningful under our table collection now. The objects actually have a name. Well, the objects don't actually have a name, but we are displaying one of the attributes of the object, and that gives more clarity as to what the object holds. So now we'll start creating our views. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our website would be such that the first page that the user goes to is probably going to be the genres page, which will have the URL genre/ and with nothing following it. So the function for that particular URL, or the response for that particular URL, we defined in here in our URLs page under the genres app, which is we'll be calling the index function in views. that is this function. Now, from that page, there will be certain links, and when the user clicks those links, he or she can move to another web page, and that is the web page where the particular article present inside our collection would be displayed. So I'll just put down in comment what pattern of the URL we are matching for each of these parts. So the first one that we are matching is just genre followed by nothing. Now our next path would be genre followed by a number. Now this number 1 here is actually the ID of the collection that the user chooses. So if the user chooses the collection fiction, which is our first collection, that has a primary key 1. So immediately the user should be sent to the next web page, which is genre/1, where 1 represents the ID of the collection chosen by the user. So now for path, let's pass the expression that will match this particular URL. And that expression is actually just an integer number, since the front part, that is genre/ is already matched. And this integer number, we are going to store it in a variable because we'll require that variable later. So you can just say int : and collection ID. Now when you do this and genre's ID, so when you do this, what happens is that this 1 gets stored in this variable genre ID, and this pattern will match this URL. Now when this URL is matched, what response do you want to give? That is, what do you want to display on that particular web page? That will be defined in another function. We'll define under views. We'll name it details for now. Of course, details is not defined. We'll do that in a while. And give a name to this too, which will be the same details. So now we are able to recognize this URL. What we need to do is next we need to define details, which will give a response to that URL. So go to your views page and you create your details function. Now what is displayed in this details function greatly depends upon the genre that is chosen by the user in the first page, which is stored again in genre's ID. So over here, you pass not only the request, but also genre ID. And inside, you'll return a HTTP response. The collection, the genre ID is the HTML tags also need to be within the quotes. Copy paste that in here, have quotes here too. And now one more thing we need to do is, so genre's ID is an integer, but we cannot concatenate an integer with a string. So we need to convert this to a string, and that's it. So let's go back to our web page and run this page. So the first page, which is genres, displays hello world. Now if I enter genre/1, which is what we created newly, run the code, you see here the genre ID is 1. In a similar manner, even if I enter 5, although we don't have a collection 5, it'll display the genre ID is 5. Now these are dummy web pages, so this kind of a display is fine. Of course, once we actually start building our view, which we will do very soon, things will be more defined. Now let's get to actually creating a good view. So what we want here is, first of all, we do not want to display any large text. So let's delete that off. We need to import our models because this is where our database is. And of course, we need to fetch information from our database to be displayed on our view. So from .models, import collection and piece. Now in our index function, what we'll do is we'll first collect all the objects from our table collection. We'll have a variable which is all collection, and then to collect all the objects, we'll use the same SQL command that we used. So that's collection.objects. So all your objects in the collection table will be stored in all collection. Now we'll store this as a dictionary so that we can iterate over these objects and display them one by one. So we say context equal to all collection is the key, and the value would be our variable all collection. So that's done. Now we need to iterate over this. So do we do that within our views itself? But there's no point of doing that, because while we are iterating over every object in our collection table, we also need to display them in a certain format. That means that we need these objects to be somehow embedded in a HTML file. And this is where we create our very first HTML file for our first page, which is the genres page. So to create our HTML page, inside genre, create another package and you name this package templates. Now inside templates, create another folder and give this package the same name as your app name, that is genre. And now inside genre, we can create a HTML file. I'll name this file genre template. So all our template or our HTML files will be in this path. Okay, so before we actually develop the genre template HTML file, we'll go back to our view and complete this section off. So now what we are saying is that we have a template, we have a HTML file, and that file will define how we need to display the objects in our collection database or our collection table. All we need to do here in our index function is actually pass these objects to our HTML file. So for this, we have a function render, and before we actually use the function, we need to import the library Django.shortcuts, under which we have this function render. This is already imported on top. I did not see that, so I'll just remove that part out. And now that you have the render function, you use that to pass your object. So what this render function does is basically, we'll pass context to it. It will type context with the template name that we pass, and it will return a HTTP response object. So you pass your request, you pass the path to your template, that is genre/templates/genre/genre template .html. So now you have passed your template to, and finally the object, which is context. So that's pretty much all you need to do for your very first view under the views file. Now we need to develop our genres template. So for our HTML file, first thing we'll change the title. Let's display our app name. So in this particular case, since I'm making a dummy website, I'm not giving it a name or anything, just going with our app name. Okay, so now we need to display our objects which have been passed from the views folder. Now the render function basically passes an object which is called object_list. So we'll create a for loop, say collection in object_list. So this way we can iterate through all the objects in our object list. And now see, this is an HTML file, but this line of code here, this is the Python code. So pretty often this will happen that you need to embed a Python code within your HTML file. So what you do is you insert your Python code within curly brace followed by the %sign. This will tell your compiler that, hey, although this is a HTML file, this line here is actually a Python instruction. So now we're able to extract each genre. In fact, I'll name this variable as genre obj. Now we need to decide how exactly we want to display these objects. So what I want is, first I want the image of that particular collection or the genre to be displayed, which is what I've stored in one of the variables. And then just below the image, I want the name of the genre to be displayed. Now this name should be clickable so that the minute the user clicks on it, we can move on to another page. And then just below the name, I want the description for that genre to be displayed. Okay, so first we have the image, img source, and in here I need to insert the link for that particular image. So the link I actually already stored in my database. As I showed, we did that through the shell and then later on through the admin page too. So how do we access that particular link? Well, just like you would in a Python code, you can access it through the variable name, and every time you're accessing or you're displaying just the value of a variable, you insert the variable name within double braces. So double braces and then genre obj dot call cover. And now I'll give it some height and width to make it look a little more appealing. We'll have minimal formatting here because the objective of this tutorial is not to show you how to write your HTML code, but how Django works. And next I'll have the name. As I said, this particular name would be clickable. So inside href, I will insert the URL of the page the user should be taken to once he clicks on the name. So that URL is what we defined here. Okay, so it's genre followed by the primary key or the ID of the category that he clicked. So that would be genre slash, and we stored it in genre ID. So that's the link the user will be taken to. And now the name that will be displayed. And then after that, finally, we have the description to be displayed. So that'll be in a H3 header. Again, double braces because we are going to just print out the value of a variable. And then after each object's details are displayed, we'll break a line. For better formatting, what I'll do is I'll have all of this embedded within a div and have it aligned to the center. So that's it. We have created our HTML file here. One more thing, I'll just say end for. So that's it. Our HTML file or our complete display for the first page has been created. So once again, I'll explain what will happen in the case of our first page only. When the user enters the URL /genre followed by nothing, Django will first check this URL's page, the main URL page. It'll see the path has matched here and the action for this has been defined as you include the genres.url page. So it goes to the genres.url page, includes this, and in this there's a function defined as a response for this particular URL, a very well-defined function, which is in our views file. So it goes to the views file, and in the views file, we have completely defined our function index. Over here, we collect all the objects in our collection table. We convert that into a dictionary so that it's iterable. Then we pass it using the render function. So the render function will take your template and it will tie that along with the context, which is the dictionary, and it will pass an object, a response object, to our HTML file. This response object will be called object.list and it is iterable. So we'll iterate through the object. We will display each object in a sort of formatted way, and that is it. And then the render function will pass this object, all collection, to our template. And over here, we will iterate over the all collection, which is the dictionary. And using this HTML code here, we'll print out the objects in all collection in a formatted way. So that's it. And one more thing, make a small correction back in the views file. So initially I had inserted the entire path to genre template.html. So the thing with the render function is that it automatically knows that it must look into the templates folder. So you have to only give the path after the template, that's genre/genre template. Now let's go back to our browser, and in here put in your URL. And there you go. So that's our first web page. You can see the image for our genre is here, and then you have the name, and then you have the description. Okay, so that's redirecting us to a page where there's an error. It says that this path is not found. So when you look at these error, guys, you will understand better as to how the matching of the URL patterns take place. First, this URL pattern, just this part after your port number, that is checked against the URL in your main URL file, that is Django projects.url file, where we have defined just genre. And then after that, it will check the files that we included in the genres URL file, that is genre followed by the genre ID. Now we had defined a dummy page for this previously, and that was being displayed too. So I'll go back to the code and figure out what the error is. The error is here, of course, I wrote genre ID, which does not signify anything as such. Now, because here we have this object genre obj. That is where all the objects from the collection table are stored one by one. So what we actually need to access is the ID for genre obj. Now I'll go back to my browser. So now I'm back to my browser, and as you can see here, we still have our front page. Click on fiction, and yeah, we got our dummy page back. So now our next step is to design this page. Go back to your code, and again, designing the page means we need to start putting content into our details function. Now, before we start designing this function, we need to populate the piece table. So again, let's go back to our admin page. We'll add the data through the admin page since that's much easier. Here you have piece and click on the add button. First, we'll add for fiction. The title we'll give, let's insert the book Origin by Dan Brown. So the artist would be Dan Brown, and it's a novel, and the year is 2017. That's the year of publication. And for the piece cover, I'll just put the book Origins front page cover. I'll just put in the image here, a link, save and add another. Now for inspiration, I'll put in the poem If, and type would be poem. Artist is Rudyard Kipling with single P. The year of publication would be 1895. And for the piece cover, another link. And finally, we'll add one to horror. The title would be The Pet Cemetery, written by Stephen King. And again, this is a novel. It's published in the year 1983. And then link. And we save this. So we are done for each of the categories or each of the genre. We have added a single article. So now that our table piece is also populated, we can start designing the view for this. So for our details page, let's start with removing this HTTP response here. So first what we need to do is we need to extract the object that the user selected from our genres page. So we say collection dot objects dot get pk equal to genre ID. So what we are doing here is, as you can see above, we use the query collection.objects.all, which returned all the objects in our table collection. Now here we are telling that, okay, I want just one object from my collections table, and that particular object is the one whose primary key matches that stored in the variable genre.id. And since genre.id is defined in this file, and it's basically the ID of the genre that the user selected, this will be a number either 1, 2 or 3. That is 1 for fiction, 2 for inspiration and 3 for horror. So now that we got that object, we will use this object cItem to extract from our piece table. So for that we say piece.object.filter, and to this we pass, and the category that we filter on is the collection, and that is our foreign key. So remember, when we created our table piece, we had a foreign key named collection. So we are saying if collection is equal to cItem, then extract that particular object from our table piece, and then we will return this again through the render method, pass the request, and in here we'll have the path to an HTML file, just like we did in the previous case, but this time a different HTML file, because we want to display this slightly differently. And then finally we need to pass the context. So we haven't created the context yet, which we will. Now, although this is just one item, every time you're passing it through the render function, you need to make a dictionary out of it. So just copy paste this here, name this pitem, pass in here pitem. And just now I did create a HTML file in the same path as before. That is, under templates you have the genre folder, and under that I created a HTML file called detail template. Nothing's filled yet, but now that we have created a file, we can put in the path here. So just copy paste this and change the genre to detail. So that's done too. Now all we have left is to actually code the HTML file. So I'll just copy paste this here and then make the required correction. So in pitem, and this would be piece object. You align its center, and piece obj is the cover. We do not really need a href here, so delete that part out, because this is the final page. We are not redirecting to any other page from here. Of course, when you're building a complete web page, this ideally, when you click on the name of an article, the article should open. We wouldn't be including that part here though, because it does not bring out any new functionality of Django. Piece obj, and here So piece obj dot title dash, and then we'll print out the author or the artist name. So piece obj dot artist, and finally we can have the year, also what this particular article is, that is the type. So that's pretty much it. We'll change the title to. So now that this is done, we'll just end the for loop. Also, this is not called cover, but now we got to change it to piece cover. And now we'll go back to our browser. So this is our genre page. Refresh it once again. And we'll click on one of the genres. And yeah, as you see, the particular piece related to that genre gets displayed. The Pet Cemetery by Stephen King, which is a novel published in the year 1983. So now we're back to our code, and well, our first and our second page is designed. It's working fine. So now we are not going to create something new. Instead, what is already created, let's modify that. Now, so far, the functions that we wrote work just fine. But Django provides this thing called generic classes or generic views. What this does is it makes writing these functions extremely easy. So now you have 4 lines of code. The exact same thing can be done in like 2 or 3 lines of code. In fact, it's not just the easier method, this is also recommended. So I'll tell you how that is done. First of all, we need to import the generic package. So from Django.views, import generic. And now let's delete this entire thing. So our first function is basically listing out all the objects in the table. So you have multiple objects, all of them are being listed out. Now this kind of a function would belong to a generic class. So far I was defining functions. Now I'm speaking about class. So is it a function or a class? Well, it is a class. It's definitely a class, but I'll show you how this class is called as a function. So first we'll finish writing the class. Now we have the class index, and this particular class type is a list view because we are listing out objects. Now under this, first we'll have a template name, which is the path to our template. And now to return our query set. So previously we were always returning a dictionary. Now we can return a query set. We have a function def query set, and under this we just say return collection.objects.all. So the same query we were using previously, but now we do not need to take the objects from the query and then convert them into a dictionary, then pass it on using the render function. We can simply do this one statement and all our objects will be sent to a template, where now in the template, so far we were saying all collection because that is the key that we were using in our dictionary, but that is no more. We are not using the render function anymore. When this query set passes an object, it's received by the template file in a variable named object list. So you replace your previous variable with object list, and that is it. With that, we finished the method for displaying our first page. Now we'll move on to the second page. So the second page is slightly different because this time we are not listing out multiple objects. We just have one object and we are basically giving out the details of the object. That means that this class, which we'll still call details, is a detail view class. So we say generic dot detail view. Let's delete all of this first. Now the function of this detail view is basically to display the details of an object. So what we need to do is first we need to define a model. Now our model is collection because we are receiving the primary key from the collection, and each of this object actually is a part of a collection. The object would not exist if the related or the counterpart genre of that object did not exist. So our model is collection, and our template name will be again the path. So that's genre detail template .html. And that's it. So this is even smaller than our generic view. Now in our detailed template, initially we had the name of the key in our dictionary. Again, this time we don't have a dictionary pass. So what is the value here? Well, the value here would be collection.piece_set.all. So this will return all the pieces related to that particular collection. And everything in small this time. Now we are almost done. Go back to your views and you see this is a generic detail view. Now the thing about the detail view class is it always accepts one parameter. Go back to your URLs file. As you are passing here a variable genre_id of int type, you don't need to do that anymore. You can simply say pk and pk will be passed to this class. And now that's the problem. So here we were calling functions, but now we have classes defined, not functions anymore. So we need to figure out a way of calling this class as a function. So for that, you just say as_view for both of these classes. And that's it. As simple as that. Now you can call your classes as a function, and since you use the generic view, now things have become so much more simpler, much smaller. Our code looks very neat. Now let's go back to our browser. Go to our front page. Let's see if everything's displayed right. Yes, it is. So our changes worked out just fine. Click on one of these tags and as you can see, the page has loaded. So much less code, very few lines of code, but things work just as fine as before. So our web page is all built, but let's add something new over here to make it look a little more like a website. One of the most common things that you find in every website you go to is a navigation bar. So let's add the navigation bar. Go back to your code. Now in here, we need a navigation bar in both our pages. So typically what you might think is the way to go about it is add the code for navigation bar in your genre template and detail template. But as you know, whenever you code, repeatability is something that you should be always against. Minimum repeatability. So instead, what we do is under genre, the same folder that has all our templates, create another HTML file and name this base. So this will be our base template and we will add the code for creating a navigation bar in here, and then we'll just include this base in our other templates. So first let's create our navigation bar. Now we'll be using Bootstrap to create the navigation bar. And every time you work with Bootstrap, the first thing you need to do is in your head section, include these 3 links. So if you have worked with Bootstrap, you probably already know you need to go to the Bootstrap website, copy these links, paste them here. So you're basically able to access some style sheets which are stored in some other system. And once that's done, you can start building your navigation bar. So in your body, you have nav class, navbar, and navbar default. So this is the class for creating your basic navigation bar. But actually we'll go with inverse instead of default. So this has a dark theme navigation bar. It will look better on our white background website. Within this, create a div tag of container fluid. So basically what the container fluid does is that your navigation bar will occupy the entire page and it will fit according to the page width. Now under this you have the navbar brand class, and the first icon I want is my home. Okay, so I put in home here, and when I click on home, whatever I want to be redirected to, whichever page I want to be redirected to, put the link for that or the URL for that in here. And I'd like to be redirected to the genres page since that's our home page. Now other elements we can include in our navigation bar. We put them as list elements. So class, navbar, and we want these elements to the right of our navigation bar. So we say navbar right. Now I'm not going into the details of this since again this is not a part of the Django tutorial. So we'll quickly just create the navigation bar. Now every element to the right will be listed out. And I'll have a registration button. So that'll be under genre/register. Now I have not created the view for this URL yet. In fact, this URL is not even identifiable yet. But for now, I'll just put that in and we'll run it all together. And finally, at the very right end corner of my navigation bar, I want to display the username. That is whichever user is currently going through my website. Now, right now we have not designed the features for all of this. We don't have a registration form itself. So a user does not mean anything to us right now. But very soon I'll show you how you can create a registration form. You can have users register to it. So then this will start making sense. So we'll say li class, and in here, the way you can extract the current user of your website is you say request.user. And that's it. That's pretty much all we need right now. Just check all the tags again. We have the navbar inverse, which is the type, the look of our navigation bar. It's container fluid. And here we actually need to specify that it's a header. So we say div class navbar header. Well, this would be closing right in the end. So I'll just format this once. And finally, down here, you insert two Python statements. You say block content. Content is a variable, so you can have any other name here. Just say block content and then end block. So why this, I'll explain to you in a while. So basically this entire part creates your navigation bar, but you require this navigation bar to be present in multiple pages. So here, when you say block content and end block, it's basically the content that will fall in each of the pages. So if I go to my genre template page, I can simply include the base template here, and then everything inside the genre template page, all this instruction to actually create that page will come under a block. So what we'll do here is we'll go to our template pages, and here we will extend our base.html file. So extends genre/base.html. And then the body, the instructions within the body will be the content of the block. So you say block content and then end block. Now we do the exact same thing with our detail template. So now this way we created a common base file for our navigation bar, and the content for each of these templates will be by turn included within this tag here. So we'll have the navigation bar present for every page. Now when we move back to our browser, you see the change here. There is a navigation bar. If you click on home, we'll be redirected to our genre page, and then click on one of the categories, and you have been redirected to the next page. The navigation bar is still present. So we also have a user here. Currently, the only user we created, the super user, it's the admin. This will change soon once we start registering people. So next step is to create a form where we can actually have users register. So for our registration page, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a URL and go in here. Let's copy this line. So the recognizable URL would just say register. So it would be genres/register. And that would call a views function called user form. And we obviously haven't defined this class yet. So yeah, this is also going to be a class. We are going to use the generic view to create this too. It's going to be pretty simple, but since it's a class, we need to call it as a function. So as view will still exist, and we'll have user form. But before we start actually creating a view for the registration page or writing our HTML file, we need to create a blueprint for the form. So why a blueprint for the form when we did not create a blueprint for our other pages? I'll tell you why, but first we need to comment this particular line because it will result in an error. And now we'll check out our admin page. Yeah, so this table here is what we'll be using to store our usernames. So the table's already present here. We'll just tweak it a little. That is, we'll take the username, we'll take the email address, and we'll take a password field. All of these actually have a password. If you click on them, you can see here, the password is hashed. So these are the 3 fields that we'll collect from the user. So we'll use the basic form, just selecting exactly what we need. So for that purpose, we need to create the blueprint. So to create the blueprint, under genre, create a Python file, calling it forms. And now in here, we'll import that table we just saw, that database. So we say django.contrib.auth.models import user. 2 imports here. So, and then we'll import the module forms. Okay, so now we can create a class called user form, which will import from forms.modelForm. And in here, we'll have a class called meta. So meta basically means the definition or a description of your class. So inside our class user form, we'll have a description for our class. And in that description, we give a model name. So a model name is user because we'll be using that particular model I just showed you. And then we'll specify the fields that we'll be using from this model, because we are not taking all the fields. We're going to ignore a few of them. So we say fields, create a list here, and within the list, we'll enter the name of the attributes that we'll be actually using for our particular form. So we have username, email, and we'll take a password. Now, unlike username and email, password is not just any char field. So over here, we have to specify the password type. So you say forms.char field, and within brackets, you say widget equal to forms.password import. So password input. So from this, your Django will know that here we basically need to take the hashed values and not just store what the user inputs as characters. So that's it. With that, we have created the blueprint of our form. Next thing is we can actually go to the views and begin writing the view, the class view for our form. So the class to create our form would be called user form view. Actually, before we proceed, we need to import this. So let's do that first. Import user form. Also need to import some other packages. Here we'll import a few packages for user authorization. That's authenticate and login. And now we can begin writing our user form view class. So to user form view, you pass the object view, And we also need to import a class for this. So let's do that. From Django.views.generic, import view. Okay, so the first thing we need to define a class for this form, and that would be the user form. And once again, a template for this form, which will define the outlook this form has. So you give a template name, which is a variable name. Actually, you can have any variable name here, just something that makes sense. Now, I don't have a template page already. So I've not created another HTML file for the form specifically, but I know that I'll be creating it, the pass genre / and the name of the HTML file. So that would be form template. Now, the minute we are done writing this view, I'll show you how we do the template. That's just basic HTML code, so I'm pretty sure you know how to work with that too. Now with forms, there are two things. There's the get method. That is basically when the user wants a form. So you give the user an empty form. And there's a post method. That is when the user puts in his or her details into the form. So with our class, with our generic classes, these methods are already defined, and within 2-3 lines, you can completely define the functionality of these. So first is the get method, to which we pass self and request. Now the first thing is you provide the form to the user, and this form is empty. So you say self.form class, and you pass nothing to this because, as I mentioned earlier too, the form is empty. And now what you do is you return this object through the render function. So basically when you do this, the form is combined with the HTML file and an object is returned. So basically when you do this, what happens is, as I mentioned earlier too, the render function works in the same way. It passes the object of the form, the content of the form, to the template, and it basically sends out a HTTP request. So that's your template name, and then finally the form itself. And as we did previously, this will be a dictionary, and that is the get function. Now we'll move on to the post. Again, you pass self and request. Now when the user enters the data and then hits the submit button, that's when the post function will be called. All the data will be stored in a particular data variable, and that is what we'll be defining in the first line. So form equal to self dot form class and request dot post. So all your data will go into this post variable. Now the next thing that the post function has to do is check if the data entered by the user does make sense. So for that you say if form dot is valid. So if the form is valid, save this data. So you say form.save. So where exactly are we saving this? Well, as I showed you previously, Django provides this table for user, this database for storing the users and the group users. So that is exactly where we'll be storing the data received through this particular form. Now, if the data is valid, we can separate out the various fields, receive their cleaned format. So first we have our username. Say username equal to form dot cleaned data, and that will be username. And then you have the password. So remember, when the user entered the data itself, it was stored in these fields. But now we are getting a cleaned version of that data and storing it in these variables, username and password. And now, unlike how we can usually put the equal to sign and assign values to certain variables, this kind of a process is not possible for passwords, because passwords are not just storing some char field data. It has a hash value. I'll show you that once again. So you see here, you go to the users, admin, and if you check this out, the password is not actually stored as just characters. It's hashed using some algorithm and then it's stored. So in this particular case, we cannot say that password is equal to this value. There's a certain function through which you pass the password such that it's stored in the required format. So for that, you say user.set password and then you pass password variable. And finally, you say user.save. So guys, over here, actually, we are saving the data in the shell, not in your database. And once our data is cleaned and everything, it is then that we are saving it into the database. So that's why we have two save statements here. So now that the user has entered their data and they have hit the submit button, we have saved the data in our database. What's next? Well, now what we want to do is we need to redirect the user to the index page. Basically, once the user is done with the registration process, there's no point of the user staying on the same page again. So we redirect them to the index page. Now, along with this, we'll also combine login. So if the user's password and username are authenticated and the user is in active status, that means that the user has logged into our website. So now we'll see how this is done. Create a object new user, and this object will hold a user if the username and the password that we pass here to this authenticate function is actually valid and they match. That is, they form a pair. So the username will be the variable username and password will be the variable password. So if the new user does exist, that is, if new user is not null, if the new user is not none, we'll check the status of the new user. So what is the status? Again, I'll take you back to that database. Go to users. Well, since we're in the middle of the code, we cannot access this page. But basically, this database or this table which stores the usernames has a field called status, which you probably would have noticed. And next to the active user, there's a green tick. So if the user has that green tick, if the user is active, that means his session is in progress. So it's basically like logging in. So you say if new user dot is active, you log in the user, so you send request and the new user object. And once the user has logged in, you return the user to the index page. And this is where you need to use a function redirect. Before we use that function, we need to, of course, import it. So here, redirect is within this same shortcuts library. We'll just add in redirect here. So index page is basically called genre. So that's where the user will be taken. Now, if this user is not authenticated, that is, there is some invalid data entered, we basically give the user back a form, an empty form, give them another chance to fill it. So for that, we just copy paste this line here, the render, put that down there. And that's it. With that, we are done creating our view for our user form. Now what we are left with is actually creating this HTML file. So let's do that. Again, go to genre, your main folder, and create a HTML file. Now remember what we named our HTML file in this view. That's form template. Make sure it's the same name. So let's start creating the form. The first thing we do is, for the form 2, we want to add the navigation bar. So go to any of your HTML files and copy out these lines here. Registration. Then you have the block content, which is exactly where you'll be putting all your content. That goes here. And then we'll start And then we'll add the end block. Again, copy paste that too. Okay, so now we can start typing out our HTML code. So first is our form tag. Now this is going to be an extremely simple, straightforward form. And now the thing with Django is whenever you're having a form, an interactive form, make sure to include this CSRF token here. So CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery that can be sent actually from, and it's a type of cross-site scripting attack that can be sent from a malicious site through your visitor's browser to your own server. So to prevent this, Django provides a very simple technique, which is where you provide this CSRF token. Now make sure you're always providing this whenever you have a post method and you're not redirecting or you're not using the URL or you're not using an external URL, because that means that your current page's CSRF token is being sent to an external web page, and obviously that kind of a leakage would hamper the security. Okay, so we'll be taking a username. Again, email is also typed text. And finally the password. And after all the fields, you have finally the submit button. And that's it. So our HTML page is also ready now. So now you need to move on to the URLs page and uncomment this, because now we actually have a response. Also, this is called user form view now. I'll just stop the server and run it again. Although this is not really necessary, if you just go back to your page, refresh it, everything works fine. Okay, now we will move on to our web page. Okay, so our home page is working fine just like before. Next, you click on register and here's your form. So as you can see here, the navigation bar is present for the form too. Now we'll create a new user named Simply with the email ID simply123@gmail.com and a password. That's it. Now click the submit button. And the minute we click the submit button, as you can see, you got transferred back to the home page. And in here, if you see the right hand corner, you'll notice that we had admin before, but now it's Simply. So that is because we just now created a user Simply. And the minute you create a user, by default, that becomes the active user. Now to check this, we will move on to the admin page. And this is our landing page. So now what happened is that since the other user that we newly created is the active user, that means we got logged out of the admin's profile. And to view the admin page, of course, we need to be logged in as the admin. So I log back in. And as you can see here, under the users group, you'll notice we have a new user created simply with the following email ID. So that's it, guys. So with that, we come to an end to a tutorial on Django. If you have any doubts, please leave them in the comment section below and we'll definitely get back to you. Also, if you like the video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. So keep learning and see you all next time.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.